Okay, so something that I frequently see people get confused about or have questions about is divided by zero and what the answers are. Because I often see people say the answer is zero, or it's undefined, or it's infinity, and these all mean very different things. These are not all the same thing. So I'm gonna just kind of go over this. Zero versus undefined versus infinity. So first off, to really understand this whole thing and why people get confused, we want to go back to the definition of multiplication and division. So, definition of multiplication. So, multiplication is defined as repeated addition. So, like if you have 5 plus 5, that is the same thing as 5 times 2, because you're adding 5. There's two 5s that you're adding together. So, when we want to compare that to division, so the definition of division is defined as multiplying by the reciprocal. So the division, it's defined in terms of multiplication. Welcome. So those of you that just joined us, I'm just going over basically the difference between zero, undefined, and infinity because people get confused. And then after that, it will be open for questions. So far, I'm just talking about first the definition, division, and multiplication so that you have a context for what these terms mean. So division is defined by multiplying by the reciprocal. So if we say we have 10 divided by 2, this is actually defined as 10 times the reciprocal of 2, which is 1 over 2. So that is our context here, basically, is we have this definition of division. So let's take a look at division by 0. I don't like that color. Let's pick this a little darker. So a lot of people get confused when we have things that involve division and involve 0. So let's start with if we have 0 divided by 2. So if we have 0 divided by something, the definition of division is that we're multiplying by the reciprocal. So this is equal to 0 times 1 over 2. Now, our rules say that if we're multiplying anything with 0, the answer is 0. So in this case, our answer is 0 here. If you have 0 and then you're dividing it by a number, you get 0. Now, let's take the other direction. So let's say we have 2 divided by 0. So our definition says this would be 2 times 1 over 0. And this is where we get an issue. That 1 over 0 is a problem because a fraction is also division. So 1 over 0 would be equal to 1 divided by 0. So if I were to kind of rewrite this, I'd have 2 times, and then I have 1 divided by 0. So that would be, again, dividing by 0 again. So you see, we're divided by 0. We keep getting in this thing where you keep trying to simplify it, and you just keep ending up dividing by 0 if you're following our rules of multiplication and a rule of what like a reciprocal means and a fraction means. You get in this thing where, again, we're dividing by 0 again. And you would just keep following this process. You would see a pattern. And there's really no answer there. So that is why we say it is undefined. Because there is no answer. There is no way to get an answer out of that. If you try to figure out 1 over 0 is by using our other rules, like the definition of multiplication or the definition of a fraction, you get stuck. Because if you also think about the fact that we have 1 over fraction or 1 over 0, that's a fraction, and the denominator tells us how many parts. How many parts you have in the whole. And then the numerator is how many parts you have. So that's the top numerator. The number of parts you have. So if we have that 1 over 0, that tells us we have 1 part out of 0 parts. How can you have 0 parts? How can you have a part when you started with 0 parts? It's a contradiction there. You can't have 1 part. Oops, I wrote of twice. You can't have 1 part if you have 0, if you're dividing something into 0 things. And that's another way to think about it when you're dividing by 0, is how can you divide this into 0 parts? You take something and then somehow make it disappear and divide it into 0 parts. That just doesn't work. I can't take an apple. I can divide it into 2 parts, so I can divide that by 2, I can divide it by 3, but I can't divide it by 0. I can't suddenly take that apple and make it disappear. So that's where we get that undefined, because it's just something we can't do. It doesn't make any sense. There's no way to take our definitions and make it work, hence undefined. So that defined comes from the definitions, and so that un means there are no definitions that make this work, basically. So that's why dividing by 0 is undefined. It's not 0. It's something very, very different. If you have 0 in the front, like the 0 divided by 2, that says I have 0 things, and I divide them into 2. Well, I can divide 0 things any way that I want because it's just nothing is there. So that's doable, but you can't do it the other way. So hopefully that kind of makes some sense if you think about it in terms of like real world things about why we can't divide by 0 and why the answer is considered undefined. So this brings us to the third part that people get confused about is infinity. And so they're like, well, I've seen a lot of people think about this and like, well, I can divide it into infinite parts. But you're not really dividing it into infinite parts. You're saying how many parts contain the whole. And that's 0 parts, not infinite. So infinity is something completely different concept. So infinity is a symbol, looks like this, and this is not the same. Why is my pen suddenly not writing? Trying to write the word same. I'll just ignore that area. Apparently it doesn't want to write there. This is not the same as undefined. Because undefined is saying that we can't find an answer because it doesn't conceptually make sense. Infinity does actually have, it's something that does make sense. If you think about it, infinity is going on forever. Time goes on forever. You can theoretically count forever. So infinity is something that makes sense and sort of exists in a very abstract way, but divided by 0 doesn't because we don't have any way to really make it work. There's no way to get an answer out of that. So that's sort of the difference between there. The difference between undefined and infinity is infinity means you're going on forever. And a division problem, we can't say if we're dividing, we go on forever. That's not, that doesn't really work, because you can't divide something, you can't continually, we're not saying that we're continually dividing this into parts forever. So that's sort of the difference there. It really doesn't want this other side of the, I was going to write infinity means going on forever. That right side of my screen just does not work. I wonder if I move it over. Yeah, so apparently that right side of the screen has just decided that I cannot write on that side anymore. I don't know what's going on with that. So that was my little spiel about undefined and zero. Hopefully I didn't confuse you guys further. I just wanted to try to explain what the word undefined means. There's no real good way to get this all on one screen. But it's, you kind of look at your definitions, and there is no definition that makes dividing by zero work. Another type of thing that's undefined is if you're doing 0 divided by 0, and that's undefined because if 0 is before the division point, it should be 0. But if 0 is after the division symbol, it's supposed to be undefined. So when you have like a contradiction like that, where your rules are kind of giving you two different things and you don't know which one is which, in math we usually do two things. We usually either, one, just make a decision and say this is what it's always going to be, or we say that it's undefined. So if there's a contradiction, if your rules are giving you two different things, then that's undefined. So that is another way to kind of think about it. Another way, if I go back to my 2 divided by 0, let's do this one in orange and see if my right side. So another way, if you think about it, 2 divided by 0 is going to be, let's say it's some number we don't know what it is. Let's say I just have a question mark. So if we look back at how multiplication works, going back, like in my example here, let's go back to the purple. 10 divided by 2 is equal to 5. Going the other way, 5 times 2 is equal to 10. So that's how you can kind of go back to where you started. So if 10 divided by 5 is 2, then 5 times 2 equals 10. So if we apply that rule to dividing by 0, then if we have 2 divided by 0, that would mean that whatever that question mark is times 0 is equal to 2. But this is impossible, because anything, whatever that number is, times 0 is always equal to 0. It's defined as 0. So we kind of get into another impossible situation there when you kind of try to rewrite your division and figure it out that way. Because you get something that just, you can't make anything times 0 be 2. So that's why 2 divided by 0 is undefined. Because if you try to sort of follow the rules of multiplication, you get yourself in another contradiction where you get something that can't be true. So that's what the undefined means, essentially. And now that you guys have learned variables for this week, I could replace that question mark with an X. Anything times 0 is 0. So if you tried to solve a problem like that, you would get something that's impossible and has a contradiction.